You torched the wrong man's bike. Ethan and I signed the contract that makes me his lawyer. When 24-year-old Ethan Hale sets fire to a stranger's Harley outside a Charlotte bar, he expects his father to make the problem disappear, because Marcus Hale always does. But the bike belongs to Dex Calloway, a member of Iron Compass MC. And Marcus isn't just any lawyer in this city. He's the club's legal counsel, bound by a decade-old contract he wrote himself. The same contract that now forces him to choose between protecting his son and honoring the man who once saved everything Marcus built. What follows is not a story about bikers versus old money. It's a story about what happens when the most powerful man in the room realizes the only thing he cannot fix is the damage he spent 15 years causing. The night the Harley burned. The parking lot behind Sully's bar on Reedsville Road was the kind of place that didn't show up on GPS and didn't need to. Regulars found it by smell, motor oil, cigarette smoke, and the particular sweetness of draft beer spilled onto hot asphalt every Friday night since 1987. The gravel was uneven. The single floodlight above the back door had been flickering for 3 weeks, and nobody had called the landlord because nobody wanted more light back there. It was that kind of parking lot. Ethan Hale had never been to Sully's before in his life. He'd driven past it twice without knowing what it was, then pulled in because his phone battery was at 4%, and he needed to sit somewhere that wasn't the front seat of his car, while he decided whether to call his father or drive into the median on I-85. He was not going to drive into the median. That thought had lasted approximately 45 seconds before it embarrassed him enough to stop. But he was drunk, genuinely, dangerously drunk, in the way that only happens when a person starts drinking at 2 in the afternoon with a specific grievance in mind. And he was furious in the particular way that comes from being told a hard truth by someone who loves you. His father had said, "You're not ready, Ethan, and I'm not doing you any favors by pretending otherwise." That was it. 11 words. No yelling, no dramatic scene, just Marcus Hale in his corner office on the 14th floor of Hale & Associates, turning back to his desk as though the conversation had concluded. Because in Marcus's world, it had concluded. Marcus Hale did not revisit decisions. He made them, filed them, and moved forward. He had been doing this to Ethan his entire life, and tonight at 9:17 on a Friday, Ethan had finally run out of the capacity to absorb it gracefully. He sat on the hood of his Audi, parked at the far edge of the gravel lot, away from the cluster of motorcycles near the door, and opened the last of the gas station whiskey he'd bought somewhere around exit 44. The motorcycles bothered him in a way that was entirely irrational, and he knew it was irrational, which made it worse. 12 bikes, maybe 13, lined up with the kind of deliberate order that suggested their owners took them seriously. Chrome catches the light even when the light is bad, and the Harley-Davidson Road King at the end of the row caught it perfectly. A deep burgundy tank, custom handlebars, the word Calloway etched in small letters on the side panel in a font that looked hand-done. Someone's pride and joy. Someone's whole personality, probably. Ethan took a drink and looked at it for a long time. The thought arrived the way bad thoughts do when a person is drunk and humiliated. Not as a plan, but as a feeling first. A hot, spreading feeling in his chest that was partly whiskey and partly 24 years of being told in various ways that he was not quite enough. Not ready, not serious, not the man his father needed him to be for the firm that bore their shared name. The feeling said, you can do something right now that no one can take back. The feeling said, let's see who handles this. He didn't decide to do it the way a sober person decides things. He slid off the hood, walked to his car, and came back with the emergency gas canister he kept in the trunk, a habit his father had drilled into him at 16 because Marcus Hale believed in being prepared for every contingency, except, apparently, this one. Ethan stood in front of the Road King for 10 seconds. Then he unscrewed the cap. He poured it in a ring around the base of the bike, stepped back, and used the lighter he'd borrowed from a woman at the gas station and never returned. He had his phone out before the flame caught. 4% battery, enough for a video. The fire spread faster than he'd expected, climbing the leather seat and licking up the fuel tank with a sound like tearing paper, and he stood there filming it with the particular blankness of someone who has crossed a line and cannot yet feel the weight of what's on the other side. The back door of Sully's banged open. The man who came through it was not a large man in the cinematic sense. He wasn't the biggest person in any room, probably, and he moved without the deliberate menace that Ethan associated with the idea of bikers from movies he'd seen in high school. He was 6 feet, maybe an inch over, with a mechanic's build, broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist. His hands, the kind that look like they've been used hard for a long time. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that had taken at least one hit that hadn't set correctly. And he was wearing a jacket with an Iron Compass MC patch on the back that Ethan registered without registering because what he was focused on was the man's face when he saw the bike. Dex Calloway stopped walking. The fire was fully alive now, orange and hungry, reflecting off the gravel in shifting patterns. The Road King was burning from the seat down, the chrome starting to lose its mirror finish as the heat found it. Dex stood 12 feet from his bike and did not move for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, Ethan watched something happen in the man's face that he would not be able to describe later with any precision. Not rage, exactly, or not only rage, but something older and deeper than rage, something that looked like a man watching a thing he'd spent years building reduced to components. Then Dex looked at Ethan. Ethan still had his phone up. The video was still recording. "Put the phone down," Dex said. His voice was quiet in a way that was not calm. Ethan did not put the phone down. He was drunk and frightened, and his brain was doing the thing it always did in frightening situations, which was to locate the nearest available defense and hide behind it. The nearest available defense was the name Hale. "You want to talk to someone about this?" Ethan said. "You can call my father." "Marcus Hale. Hale and Associates. He's—" "I know who Marcus Hale is." Dex took 1 step forward, then stopped himself. His hands were at his sides, open, which Ethan would understand later was the effort of a man overriding a reflex. "I'm going to ask you one more time to put the phone down." The back door opened again. 3 men came through, big fast, reading the situation before they were fully outside. One of them went immediately to the bike with a fire extinguisher that had apparently materialized from somewhere inside the bar. Because of course it had, because these were men who knew where the fire extinguisher was. The foam hit the burning leather with a sound like a wave breaking, and the light in the parking lot changed as the fire died. The man who came out last was older than the others, with a gray-streaked beard and the unhurried movements of someone who had learned across many decades that urgency was mostly wasted energy. He looked at the bike. He looked at Dex. He looked at Ethan, and then at the phone, still in Ethan's hand. "Rafe," Dex said without looking at him. "Call Marcus." Rafe Ortega, club president of Iron Compass MC, a title that had taken him 20 years and 2 separate federal investigations to earn, pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. He held the phone to his ear and watched Ethan with the same mild, assessing expression a man might use to look at a crack in a load-bearing wall. Ethan noticed that no one was yelling. No one was moving toward him aggressively. This was somehow worse than if they had been. "Marcus," Rafe said into the phone. "It's Rafe. We've got a situation at Sully's. Someone burned Dex's Road King in the parking lot." A pause. "Yeah, it's a Hale problem." Another pause, longer. "His name is Ethan." The silence on Rafe's end of the call lasted 3 full seconds. Ethan knew, even drunk, even in the jagged aftermath of what he'd just done, that silence on a phone call has texture. That particular silence had the texture of a man who had just been handed the worst possible version of a problem he already knew he had. When Rafe lowered the phone, he looked at Ethan with an expression that was almost pitying. "Your father says he'll be here in 20 minutes. He says stay where you are and don't say anything else." He paused. I'd listen to him. Ethan looked at his phone. 3% now. The video had saved automatically to his camera roll. He sat back down on the hood of the Audi and waited. And for the first time since he'd picked up the gas canister, the alcohol buzz was receding enough to let in the cold air and the smell of burned leather and extinguisher foam. Dex was crouched next to what was left of his bike, touching nothing, just looking. His hand was near the scorched side panel where the name Calloway had been etched, but he didn't touch it. He crouched there for a long time, very still, in the way a person is still when they are working to keep something inside. None of the club members spoke to Ethan while they waited. One of them took pictures of the damage. Another wrote something in a notebook, an actual paper notebook, which struck Ethan as oddly methodical. The man with the fire extinguisher went back inside. The floodlight above the door continued to flicker. 17 minutes later, headlights swept across the far end of the lot, and a silver Mercedes CLK pulled in with the precise, deliberate slowness of a man who was controlling every movement, because controlling movements was all that was left to him. Marcus Hale stepped out of the car in a shirt that wasn't quite fully tucked, which meant he had left a house in a hurry, which meant the call from Rafe had shaken something loose. He was 61 years old and looked most of the time like a man who had designed himself to appear perpetually composed. He did not appear perpetually composed at 9:47 on a Friday night in the parking lot of Sully's bar. He looked at the bike first. Then he looked at Dex, who had straightened up and was watching him approach. Then he looked at Ethan. Something passed between Marcus and Dex in that exchange. Ethan saw it, without understanding it, the way you see two people communicate in a language you haven't been taught. Marcus's jaw tightened in a specific way, not toward anger, but toward something more complicated, and Dex's expression didn't change at all, which was its own kind of statement. "Dex," Marcus said. "Marcus." Dex's voice was flat and even. "Your son burned my bike." "I know." Marcus looked at Ethan for a long moment. "I know he did." He turned back to Dex, and there was something in his posture, a slight forward lean, the unconscious weight shift of a man moving toward an obligation that Ethan had never seen on his father before. "Can we talk? The two of us?" Dex looked at him steadily. "Sure," he said. "We can talk." They walked to the far edge of the lot, near the fence line where the floodlight didn't reach, and they stood there for 8 minutes while Ethan sat on the hood of his car and the remaining club members processed the scene around him. Ethan could not hear what was being said. He watched his father's posture and tried to read it, because he had spent his whole life learning to read his father's posture, the set of the shoulders, the inclination of the head. And what he saw in those 8 minutes in the dark near the fence line was that Marcus Hale was not negotiating. He was not managing. He was listening to Dex Calloway the way you listen to someone who has authority over you, and it was the most disorienting thing Ethan had seen in his life. His father did not listen that way to anyone. When Marcus came back, he stood in front of Ethan and said quietly, "We're going home. Tonight, you don't speak. You don't post anything. You don't make any calls. Tomorrow morning I need you to come to my office, not as my son, as someone who has done serious damage and needs to understand the full extent of it." "Dad." "Not tonight, Ethan." His voice had no heat in it. That was the worst part. "Not tonight." He drove Ethan home in the Mercedes with the windows down and said nothing more the entire way. When Ethan got out at his apartment building, Marcus waited until he was through the door, then sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes before he drove away. Ethan watched from his second-floor window. He had never seen his father sit still like that in a car, not moving, not on his phone, just sitting in the dark. He looked, Ethan thought, like a man trying to figure out how long he'd been walking in the wrong direction. Ethan didn't sleep. He lay on his couch with his shoes still on, and the ceiling fan going at its lowest setting, and replayed the parking lot in the particular merciless way the mind replays things when alcohol is wearing off and reality is becoming fully load-bearing again. The fire had been beautiful, was the sick part. The way it had moved up the leather fast, purposeful, like it knew where to go, had been genuinely beautiful, and he hated that he'd noticed that. Hated that the part of his brain responsible for aesthetic appreciation had been running in parallel with the part doing something unforgivable. His phone had charged to 11% on the car charger during the drive home. He opened his camera roll and watched the video 3 times. In it, he looked happy. That was the word. Flushed and loose and happy in the way people look when they've finally done the thing they'd been building toward without knowing it. He watched himself film the burning bike with the hand that wasn't holding the whiskey, and he watched his own face, and he tried to locate somewhere in that face the person he thought he was. He was not finding him. He deleted the video. Then he sat up because deleting it felt like covering something up, which was what he'd always watched his father do. Not through dishonesty exactly, but through the careful management of what was known, by whom, and when. Hale and Associates had been built partly on Marcus's extraordinary ability to control the shape of a story before it reached anyone who could use it against you. Ethan had grown up watching this and absorbing it as normal, and now he had just, without thinking, applied the skill to himself in the worst possible way. He undeleted the video. He didn't know how to undelete a video. He spent 11 minutes figuring out the recently deleted folder on his phone, and when he got it back, he put the phone face down on the coffee table and did not touch it again. Around 2 in the morning, he thought about calling his father. He thought about it for 40 minutes, working through what he would say, the various angles, the way you draft an argument before a negotiation. Another thing he'd learned from Marcus. He wanted to say that he hadn't intended for it to go as far as it did. He wanted to say that he'd been drunk, and it had seemed funny in the way things seem funny when they're actually expressions of something painful, and that he knew that wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation, and that he needed his father to hear the explanation before making any decisions. He wanted underneath all of that to say, "Please fix this, like you always do. Please make one phone call and handle it, and tell me what to say and who to say it to." He did not call. He knew, in the way you know things at 2 in the morning, that your daylight brain will spend considerable energy arguing against that his father was not going to fix this. He had seen Marcus's face in the parking lot. He had seen the way his father had walked toward Dex Calloway, not as a man approaching a problem, but as a man approaching an obligation. And those were 2 entirely different postures, and he did not yet know what that difference meant, but he knew it was going to matter. At 3 in the morning, he fell asleep on the couch. At 7:45, he woke up to 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, and a text from his friend Corey that said only, "Bro, is that your car in this video?" Below it was a link to a Twitter post that had, at time of Corey's text, 67 retweets. Someone had been in the parking lot of Sully's bar the night before, with a better vantage point and more battery life than Ethan. The video was 40 seconds long and caught everything from the moment the first flame caught, including Ethan's face in profile as he stepped back, and including, unmistakably, in the flickering light, the North Carolina vanity plate on the Audi that read, "Hale, 24. Ethan sat on his couch with a tightening chest and watched the view count on the tweet climb from 400 to 900 in the time it took him to drink half a glass of water. He called his father at 7:51. Marcus picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake for a while, which meant he already knew. "I see it," Marcus said before Ethan could speak. "Come to the office, 8:30. "Dad, I need you to..." 8:30, Ethan. A pause that had the same texture as the one in the parking lot, full, heavy, containing things not being said. "And bring the video from your phone." "I deleted it. I undeleted it. I have it." "Good." Another pause. That's the right thing." It was, Ethan realized, possibly the first time in recent memory that his father had said those words to him. And the fact that it had taken burning a man's motorcycle and an incriminating Twitter video to get there was the most depressing sentence he'd managed to construct all morning. He showered, put on the closest thing he had to appropriate clothes, and drove to the 14th floor of Hale and Associates, where his father was waiting in the corner office, with the door open and coffee already poured. and where the entire conversation that followed was conducted at a volume that never once rose above the normal register of a professional consultation between two men who happened to share a last name. That was how they did things. That had always been how they did things, and for the first time, staring at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind his father's desk, Ethan found himself wondering if the fact that they had always done things this way was itself a very large part of the problem. Marcus said, "Dex Calloway is not a stranger. I need you to understand that before anything else." Ethan said, "Who is he?" His father looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Someone I owe," he said finally. "Someone I owe in a way that money does not settle." It was the most his father had said about owing anyone in Ethan's living memory. Marcus Hale did not speak about debts, not because he didn't have them, but because acknowledging a debt shifted the power dynamic in a way that made him uncomfortable. Ethan sat with that sentence and said nothing. "Go home," Marcus said. "I'll call you when there's a plan." "And if I want to be part of making the plan?" Marcus looked at him with the particular tiredness of a man who has been asked a question that has no good answer. "Go home, Ethan." Ethan went home. He sat in his apartment and he waited, and the Twitter video climbed to 4,000 retweets, and he watched it happen with his phone propped against a coffee mug, and he tried to remember the last time in his life he had done something that could not be undone. And he could not think of one. His father had always found the edge of the damage and stopped it there. Every time. He was starting to understand, in the slow, nauseating way that understanding comes when it's too late to be useful, that this might have been the problem. The tweet was taken down at 9:43, not by Twitter, but by the original poster, who received a phone call from a blocked number at 9:31 and did not explain their decision to anyone. Ethan noticed this from his couch and felt for approximately 6 minutes the familiar relief of something being smoothed over. Then he felt sick. Then he felt angry at himself, then at his father, then at himself again for being angry at his father for doing the thing he had been counting on his father to do. He called Corey back. Corey was 26, worked in commercial real estate, and had the particular talent of treating everything in life as fundamentally manageable with the right approach. "Okay," Corey said after Ethan had given him the version of events that left out the gas canister and replaced it with a vague implication of an accident. "So, worst case, you pay for the bike. What does a Harley cost, like 15 grand? You have 15 grand. It's not about the money. Everything is about the money, man. Call your dad. Have him cut a check. Done." "My dad is..." Ethan stopped. "It's complicated." "How is it complicated? Your dad is a lawyer. He solves complicated things." Ethan said nothing. "Ethan," Corey's voice shifted slightly. "Did you actually burn the bike on purpose?" A pause that lasted 2 seconds too long. "Jesus," Corey said. "I was drunk." "Man." A long exhale. "Man, that's okay. Okay, call your dad." "I already talked to my dad." "Then let him handle it. That's literally what dads are for. Especially your dad. Marcus Hale handles things like that's his whole brand. You're fine." Ethan hung up. He thought about what Corey had said, that's his whole brand, and sat with the sourness of it. It was true. Marcus Hale's entire identity, personal and professional, was constructed around the capacity to handle things. Handle the case, handle the client, handle the fallout, handle the kid. Ethan had been handled so many times and in so many different ways that he had never developed the internal architecture to handle anything himself. And he had never examined this too closely, because the alternative, developing that architecture, actually becoming capable, would have meant confronting the possibility that his father had been compensating for something. And Ethan had not been ready to look at that. He was 24 years old. He had been to the right schools, driven the right car, worn the right clothes, said the right things at the right dinners. He had applied to join his father's firm 3 times, been told no twice, and then told not yet, and then told yesterday, not ready. He had not, in the year since finishing law school, taken and passed the bar exam, because every time he sat down to study the material, he encountered the same problem. The material was his father's material. The cases were cases Marcus had taught him to see through Marcus's eyes. And somewhere in the middle of every study session, he would realize that he didn't know actually why he wanted to be a lawyer, as opposed to why his father wanted him to be one. He did not think about this too much when it surfaced, because thinking about it too much led to the median on I-85, metaphorically if not literally. And Ethan was very skilled at not thinking about things too much. He thought about it now, though. Sitting on his couch in daylight, with the tweet taken down and the situation theoretically being handled, he thought about it and found that it connected in ways he didn't fully want to follow, to a burning motorcycle and a man's face in a parking lot watching something he'd built being destroyed, with the particular stillness of someone absorbing a blow they'd taken before and knew how to survive. Dex Calloway had not looked at Ethan with fear or rage or the desire for confrontation. He had looked at Ethan the way you look at evidence of something you already suspected about the world, which was somehow worse than anything else. Ethan picked up his phone and searched the name. Dex Calloway, Charlotte Iron Compass, MC. There was a business listing, Calloway Custom Cycles, a repair and restoration shop on Beatty's Ford Road, open since 2009. A few news references peripheral, a 14-month-old Facebook post showing the Road King freshly painted with the caption, 10 years, finally got her the way she deserved. The photo had been liked 212 times. He closed the browser. He sat on his couch. Somewhere in the city his father was making calls, and for the first time in his life, Ethan was not entirely sure which direction those calls were going. What a Hale man does. Marcus Hale arrived at Calloway Custom Cycles on Beatty's Ford Road at 11 on Saturday morning, before calling ahead because he had learned over 40 years of legal practice that certain conversations went better when the other person did not have time to prepare for them. He parked on the street and sat in the car for a moment looking at the shop front. It was the kind of building that had been repurposed twice, originally a gas station, then a tire shop. Now, a motorcycle repair and restoration business that wore its history in layers. The old pump island still visible as a concrete platform, the bay doors painted a deep red that was newer than everything around it. And above the entrance, a sign in clean, unfussy lettering that said, Calloway Custom Cycles, with the word custom in a slightly larger font that felt like a point of pride rather than just a design choice. Marcus had driven past this shop probably 100 times in the last decade. He had never stopped. Dex was in the first bay, working on a bike that was not his own. He had the fuel tank off and was examining something in the carb with the focused interior attention of a man who was thinking about the problem in front of him and not the one behind him, or who was performing very skillfully the appearance of this. He did not look up when Marcus came in, which meant he had heard the car and made a decision. Dex, Marcus said, give me a minute. He was wiping something with a cloth, turning a small component in his hands, examining it. He set it down on the workbench, laid the cloth over it, and then straightened up and turned around. And Marcus saw that he looked exactly as he had at 9 o'clock last night. Same jacket, same expression, the particular steadiness of someone who had processed something painful in the small hours and come out the other side of it into a cold, clear place. I came to talk about compensation, Marcus said. I know last night you said, I said I wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. I remember what you said. I'm asking you to hear me out. Dex leaned back against the workbench and crossed his arms and looked at Marcus in a way that suggested he was prepared to listen, but not prepared to be managed. These were different things, and Dex knew it. All right, he said. Marcus opened his briefcase on the nearest flat surface, the corner of a steel workbench near the bay door, and pulled out a folder. Full replacement value of the bike, plus restoration costs, given the custom work that was lost. I've had it estimated at, I don't need your estimate. I know what she was worth. $32,000 plus additional damages for loss of use and any documented emotional... Marcus? Dex's voice was not loud, but it stopped him. I know what you're doing. You did it in the parking lot last night, too. You're running the play where you come in with a number before the other side has had time to calculate their own, because you know the number you're offering is fair enough to be tempting and fast enough to make the problem go away before it becomes a record. He paused. I've watched you do this for other people. I know how it works. Marcus lowered the folder. He was quiet for a moment. Is the number wrong? The number is fine. Dex looked at him steadily. It's not about the number. Then tell me what it's about. I want to know who did it. Dex uncrossed his arms and put his hands on the workbench edge, casual but not quite relaxed. You said a Hale problem on the phone last night. Rafe didn't say a name, but whoever called him must have, because Rafe looked at me and said, it's a Hale problem, and waited to see how I'd take it. So I know it's not a random kid. I know there's a last name involved, and I know you drove over in the middle of the night rather than handle it by phone, which you could have done. I want to know whose name is on this. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. This was the part he'd been rehearsing since he'd pulled out of Sully's parking lot last night. Since the drive home, the 3 hours of non-sleep that followed the shower at 6 that hadn't done anything useful, the coffee he'd made and not drunk. He had been rehearsing a version of this conversation in which he controlled the information, carefully enough to arrange a settlement without Dex ever needing to know the specific name. And he had known, even as he rehearsed it, that it was not going to work that way. Dex Calloway was not a person who accepted partial information and moved on. He never had been. My son, Marcus said. The silence that followed lasted about 5 seconds and contained, Marcus estimated, approximately everything. Dex's expression did not move, not toward anger, not toward anything dramatic. But something shifted behind his eyes, in the way it does when a piece of information lands and begins immediately reorganizing the furniture. Your son, Dex repeated. His name is Ethan. He's 24. He was drunk and he made a catastrophically bad decision. And I am not here to defend that decision. I'm here because I owe you a straight conversation at minimum, and I'm giving you that. How long have you known? Since Rafe called? And you knew it was Ethan before you drove over? Yes. Dex was quiet for a moment. He looked at the workbench, at the cloth laid over the small component, and then back at Marcus. And your plan last night when you walked over and asked if we could talk? What was that plan? Marcus, who had built a career on never appearing at a loss, appeared at a loss. I was going to offer settlement and ask you to keep the name out of any filing. To protect him. Yes. And you decided not to do that. I decided I owed you the truth instead. Marcus picked up the folder and set it back in the briefcase. The offer stands. The number is real, and it's yours if you want it. But I'm not going to ask you to protect his name. That's not a thing I'm willing to ask you for. Dex looked at him for a long time. Outside, a car went by on Beatty's Ford, and the sound of it went through the bay door and made the space feel very still by comparison. You could have not told me, Dex said finally. You could have sent a check from a corporate account with a number too good to argue with, and I'd have taken it, and I'd never have known whose kid it was. Why didn't you do that? Marcus looked at him. Because 10 years ago you got on a witness stand and told the truth when it would have been easier and probably safer for you to be elsewhere. I've been trading on that ever since. I wasn't going to use your goodwill to bury this. Dex said nothing. He turned back to the workbench and picked up the cloth and the component and turned it in his hands again, not because he needed to examine it, but because he needed something to do with his hands while he thought. Marcus waited. He was good at waiting. I'm not taking the settlement, Dex said finally. He set the component down again. Not yet. I want to meet him. That's... Marcus stopped himself before he said complicated, because he had been saying complicated to people his whole career as a way of saying no without saying no, and he was trying this morning to be a different kind of person than that. I can arrange that. And I want to know what happens to him. Not because I want to watch him suffer. I want to know if he understands what he actually did. A bike can be replaced, I know that. But the person who set fire to it was filming himself do it. He wanted to watch it burn. That means something about who he is right now. And I want to know if that changes. Marcus stood in the bay door of Calloway Custom Cycles with a briefcase containing a settlement offer and listened to Dex Calloway describe his son more accurately than Marcus had managed in a recent conversation with Ethan. And he did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that would not be self-serving. "I'll bring him," Marcus said. "Give me a few days." He walked back to the Mercedes and sat in it again for a moment, looking at the shop in the rearview mirror. He could see Dex through the bay door, already back at the workbench, working on the component with that same focused attention. Marcus turned the key in the ignition, and then did not immediately drive. And in the rearview mirror he watched a second man come into the bay from the back of the shop. Younger, maybe 19, wiping grease off his hands on a rag and say something to Dex. And Dex look up briefly and respond, and the kid nod and go back to work. Dex had an apprentice. Dex ran a business. Dex had built something on Beatty's Ford Road that was now 14 years old. And the man who came in to help him build it had stood on a witness stand and told the truth. And in exchange, Marcus had made sure the building stayed standing. That was the shape of what was between them. Marcus had understood this for a long time in the abstract way you understand things you do not examine directly. He was examining it directly now, and finding it much heavier than abstract. He drove to his office. He called Ethan at noon and got voicemail. He called again at 12:15. Ethan picked up on the third ring and said, "Dad," in the voice of someone who had been awake since early morning, watching a tweet count and not eating anything. "I need you to come to the office Monday morning," Marcus said. "I need you to meet someone." A pause. "Is it?" "Yes." "It's Dex Calloway." Another pause, longer. "He asked to meet you, Ethan. Not to threaten you, not to start anything. He wants to look you in the face. I think you owe him that." "What did you tell him about me?" "I told him your name. I told him your age. I told him you were drunk." He pulled into the Hale & Associates parking structure. "I didn't tell him anything else because there isn't anything else to say yet. What happens on Monday starts filling in the rest." He parked and sat in the car and added, "I didn't take the tweet down, Ethan. I don't know where you heard that it came down. I didn't do it." Silence on the line. "Someone did," Ethan said slowly. "Yes, someone did. I don't know who." Marcus turned the engine off. "I want you to understand whatever happens next, it won't be managed. Not this time. I'm not in a position to manage this one." Ethan said nothing for a moment, then, "Because of who he is?" "Yes." "Who is he to you, exactly?" Marcus looked at the concrete pillar in front of the car, at the level marker painted in yellow, at the strip light above it, flickering slightly in the way that all strip lights in parking structures flicker, regardless of how new they are. "Someone I owe," he said. "I told you that already." Dad, that doesn't tell me anything." "Monday," Marcus said. "Come Monday, and I'll tell you the rest." He got out of the car and went upstairs to his office, and he stood at the window for a while, looking at Charlotte laid out below him in the Saturday light. And he thought about Dex Calloway's hands on the workbench, and about the Road King reduced to foam and scorched metal, and about a courtroom in this same city 10 years ago, where a man he barely knew had stood up and told the truth, and about all the mornings since then when Marcus had woken up and made decisions about what Ethan should and should not have to face, and whether any single one of those decisions would look in honest daylight like love. He was not entirely sure they would. By Sunday evening, the video had reappeared on a different account and accumulated 19,000 views. Marcus looked at it once and did not look again. Ethan texted him at 9 p.m. "I see it. I'm not going to try to take it down." Marcus read this and set his phone on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a while. And then he typed back, "Good. That's the right call." he meant it. He was aware that he kept meaning it, and that meaning it was the easy part. Rafe Ortega called Sunday night at 10. "Members are talking," he said. "Word about Ethan is around the club. A couple of guys want to handle it the old way." "What does Dex want?" "Dex is being Dex. Hasn't said much either direction. That's how you know he's actually angry. He gets quieter, not louder." A pause. "I'm going to be honest with you, Marcus. I can hold them for a while. I can't hold them indefinitely. You need to move on this." "I'm moving," Marcus said. "Monday." "Monday works." Another pause. "For what it's worth, and I know this is a strange thing to say, I think what you did, coming out there in person and telling Dex whose kid it was, I think that meant something to him." He didn't say so, but I know Dex. It was the least I could do. "Yeah," Rafe said. "It was. But a lot of people can't manage the least they could do so." Marcus said goodnight and hung up, and stood in his kitchen for a while, and the house was very quiet around him, in the way it had been very quiet for 12 years. Since Ethan's mother had been taken out of it, room by room, over the long months of her illness, and in the silence he allowed himself to think as directly and honestly as he could manage about whether his love for Ethan had been love for Ethan specifically, or love for the version of Ethan that Marcus had been curating since Elena died. Quieter, more manageable, pre-approved, protected from the unruly consequences of his own choices. He didn't like the answer that presented itself. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. Two sides of the same contract. The folder that Dex Calloway placed on Marcus Hale's desk at 8:47 on Monday morning was not dramatic in appearance. It was a standard manila folder, slightly worn at the corners, the kind that has lived in a file cabinet for a long time and been moved between locations a few times without being opened. But what it contained was a copy of a legal agreement that Marcus had drafted himself, 10 years, 4 months, and 19 days ago, and the sight of it on his own desk, his own handwriting on the cover sheet, his own signature at the bottom of the last page, had the specific effect of briefly removing all air from the room. Ethan was already there when Dex arrived. He had come early, which Marcus noted, and sat in the chair near the window with his hands on his knees, wearing a jacket that was too formal for the occasion, which told Marcus he had gotten dressed in the dark space between trying to look appropriate and not knowing what appropriate looked like here. He looked up when Dex walked in, and some calculation ran behind his eyes, the instinctive social sorting that people of Ethan's background did automatically, cataloging someone's age, clothing, and bearing in a fraction of a second to determine what category to put them in. Marcus watched this happen and watched it resolve into something more uncomfortable, because Dex was not going to resolve into any category Ethan had convenient access to. Dex sat down across from Marcus, placed the folder on the desk, and said, "Before we talk about what happens next, I want to make sure we're all reading from the same document." Marcus looked at the folder. "Where did you get that?" "You gave it to me 10 years ago when we finalized the retainer agreement. You gave me a copy because you said a client should always have a copy of what they've signed." He paused. "I've held on to it. I'm a careful person." Marcus opened the folder and looked at the pages in the same way a person looks at something they've tried very hard not to see directly for a while. The agreement was 12 pages, drafted in the particular, clear, unambiguous language that Marcus used when he wanted a contract to be proof against clever argument later, which was always. He turned to page 7. "Section 4, subsection C," Dex said without needing to look at the page. He had read it recently enough to have it memorized, which told Marcus something about how the last 2 days had been spent. "Any individual who sustains property damage or personal injury attributable to the actions of any client of Hale and Associates or any immediate family member of such client, and who is a current member in good standing of Iron Compass MC at the time of said damage or injury, shall be entitled to legal representation by Hale and Associates at no cost in any civil or criminal matter arising from the incident." Ethan had turned toward the desk. He was listening now with the focused attention of a person who has just realized they are in a different kind of conversation than they thought they were entering. "You've had clients who were members?" Marcus said. "7 in 10 years. A couple of them small things, nothing that ever activated this clause." Dex looked at Marcus directly. "Your son was listed as a consultant for Hale and Associates for 1 week in March of this year. Clerical work, it looks like, but it's on the firm's public record. That puts him inside the definition of client-family member under the contract terms." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences earlier in this conversation. It was a working silence, the kind in which multiple people are simultaneously processing the same logical structure and arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. Marcus was first, because he was a lawyer and this was his contract, and he'd written the clause and knew exactly what it said. Ethan was second, slightly slower, because he'd had 3 years of law school but hadn't taken the bar, and so was translating rather than reading. And then both of them arrived at the same place at approximately the same moment. "You're saying I have to represent you?" Marcus said. "I'm saying the contract I signed with you says you're already representing me, as of the moment the damage occurred, under your own terms." Dex looked at him steadily. "I'm not threatening you. I'm reading you your own document." Ethan said, "That's..." and stopped. "Go ahead," Dex said, turning to look at him for the first time since he'd come in. Ethan met his eyes and held them, which Marcus noticed. He had expected Ethan to look away. "That's a conflict of interest," Ethan said. "You can't represent both of us." "No," Marcus said. "I can't. So you have to pick." The word pick sat in the room like an object someone had dropped. Marcus looked at his son and at the man whose property his son had destroyed, and thought about the clause he had written himself, had written it specifically carefully in the belief that the people who depended on him should have that protection clearly documented, should have it in writing, should not have to take it on faith. He had written it well. He'd been proud of it at the time. "There's another option," Ethan said carefully. He was trying, Marcus could see, to think like a lawyer, to find the third path, the procedural solution, the way out that wasn't a choice. You could declare the conflict, bring in outside counsel for Dex, and continue to represent. "The contract doesn't allow for substitution without client consent," Marcus said. "Dex would have to agree to outside counsel, and the original obligation to represent him directly came from a clause I negotiated specifically because club members had been underserved by substituted counsel in the past. If I push for substitution now, in a situation where my own family is on the other side..." He stopped. He looked at the folder. "It would be a knowing violation of the spirit of the agreement. Any ethics panel that looked at it would say so." "What happens if you violate it?" Ethan asked. Marcus looked at his son. "State bar investigation? Possible suspension? Possible disbarment, depending on findings." The word disbarment landed in the room and remained there. "So," Ethan said slowly, "the options are you represent Dex and I find my own lawyer. Or you violate the contract and risk your license. Or..." He stopped again. "Or I represent you," Marcus said, "and knowingly default on an obligation to Dex, and Dex has grounds to file a bar complaint that would include documentation of both the original contract and the conflict." He closed the folder. He looked at Dex. "Any of this wrong?" "No," Dex said. Ethan sat back in his chair, and the jacket that was slightly too formal for the occasion settled around him in a way that made him look for a moment very young. Marcus had not seen him look young in a long time. He had been performing a kind of performed adulthood for most of his 20s, going through the motions of ambition and competence and knowing what he was doing. And the performance had been good enough, mostly, to hold up. In this office, at this desk, with this folder between them, it was not holding up. "Why did you come in with the folder?" Ethan asked. He was talking to Dex now. "You could have filed a complaint directly, started the process moving. Why come here first?" Dex looked at him for a moment before answering. Because I wanted to see what your father would do when there wasn't an angle." The sentence sat there. Marcus did not look away from it. "I've watched Marcus Hale work for 10 years. Dex continued. "He's good. He's one of the best I've seen at finding the third path, the exit that gets everyone out without too much damage. I wanted to know what he'd do in a room where the third path was that." He gestured toward the folder. "Ethics violation, career damage, 10 years of reputation. I wanted to see which way he'd go." "And?" Marcus asked. Dex looked at him steadily. "The jury's still out," he said. "That's why I'm sitting here instead of at the bar association." Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and silenced it, but not before Marcus saw the notification. A comment thread on the video which had apparently resurfaced somewhere new. Neither of them addressed it directly. Marcus made a note internally to look at it later, and then decided almost immediately that he was not going to look at it later. What happened with the video was going to happen with the video. He was done trying to manage the shape of what was known. "I need a few days," Marcus said to Dex, "to handle the formal notice of conflict. I'll file with the state bar proactively, full disclosure, the terms of the agreement, the situation. Not to get ahead of a complaint, because it's the right procedure." Dex nodded once. "I'll wait. And I'd like to bring Ethan here when I file, so he understands the full record of what this is." "That's between you and your son," Ethan said quietly. "I'll be there." Marcus looked at him. The jacket was still slightly too formal, and Ethan was still sitting with his hands on his knees in the posture of someone who was not sure what to do with his body in this room. And there was something in his face that Marcus was trying to read and couldn't quite. It wasn't contrition, exactly, not yet, and it wasn't defiance. It was something more like the expression of a person looking at a mechanism they've spent their whole life inside and seeing for the first time how the gears actually worked. Dex stood and picked up the folder. He was going to take it back, Marcus noted. Of course he was. "One more thing," he said. He was looking at Ethan now. "The Road King one was restoring for 10 years. The finish on the tank, I did it myself. 3 coats, 2 weeks drying time between each one. The embossed lettering on the side panel was done by a guy in Asheville who passed away last year. There is no replacing that work specifically. You can replace the bike. You can't replace what was in it." He held Ethan's eyes. "I'm not saying that so you'll feel worse than you already do. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that the thing you burned wasn't just property." He walked out. His footsteps on the hardwood in the hallway were steady and even. And then the elevator doors opened and closed, and Marcus and Ethan were alone in the office, with the city behind the glass and the cleared spot on the desk where the folder had been. Neither of them spoke for a while. "The guy in Asheville," Ethan said finally, "who passed away." "Yes," Marcus said. "Did you know about that? About the bike?" "No. I knew Dex had been restoring it. I didn't know the specifics." Ethan looked at the desk. "I filmed it," he said. The words came out slightly differently from the way they'd come out before, not as an admission exactly, but as something he was examining. "I filmed it, and I was glad. For like 30 seconds, I was genuinely glad. And that's the part I can't." He stopped. Marcus waited. "That's the part I don't know what to do with," Ethan finished. Marcus looked at his son and thought about everything he'd intended to say in this conversation, on the carefully prepared, understanding, the managed, acknowledgement, the roadmap forward, and found that none of it was coming. What came instead was something simpler and much less rehearsed. "Neither do I," he said. "Not yet." He stood and moved to the window, and Charlotte was there, below them in the Monday morning light. And somewhere on Beatty's Ford Road, a shop was opening that had been built over 14 years by a man with careful hands who knew where the fire extinguisher was and took good care of things and had a long time ago told the truth in a courtroom because it was the right thing to do. Marcus looked at the city and thought about what it would take to build something that meant that much to you. He thought about it carefully and without flinching, which was something he had not been in the habit of doing and was going to have to practice. Behind him, he heard Ethan shift in the chair. "What do I do now?" Ethan asked. Marcus turned around. "You wait," he said, "and when I call you, you come." He meant it differently than he'd ever meant come before. Not come and I'll handle it. Not come and stand behind me while I fix this. He meant come and stand in the room where the consequences are and do not look away from them. He wasn't sure Ethan knew the difference yet. He thought for the first time in a long time that Ethan might be capable of learning it. He wasn't sure of this either, but he thought it, and that was new. Later that afternoon, Marcus's assistant knocked on his door to tell him that a certified letter had arrived from a paralegal at a firm he didn't recognize, a small shop in Noda, notifying him that one Ethan James Hale was being represented by outside counsel retained independently, and that all future contact regarding the matter of the fire at Sully's bar should be directed to the named attorney. Marcus read the letter twice. He set it on his desk next to his phone. He thought about how long it had taken Ethan to make that call, probably since the meeting, probably within the hour, and what it meant that he had made it without asking Marcus first. He picked up his phone and texted Ethan. "Got the letter. This is the right move." Ethan texted back. "I know." Marcus set his phone down. The afternoon light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows in long parallels across his desk, picking out the dust in the air, and the office was very quiet. And in the quiet, Marcus sat and thought about the 10 years between the courtroom where Dex Calloway told the truth and this Monday afternoon, and about all the decisions he'd made in the space between. He thought about whether they would survive examination, those decisions. He thought about what it would mean to examine them honestly, one at a time, in daylight. He pulled out a legal pad and uncapped a pen. He did not write the contract clause or the bar disclosure. He wrote in the careful longhand of a man trying to be precise a list that started, "Things I shielded Ethan from, and the reasons and what it cost." He wrote for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the desk and went gold and then went dim. He kept writing. The name on the contract. The formal disclosure to the North Carolina State Bar arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after the fire at Sully's, 9 days after the meeting in Marcus's office, 5 days after the certified letter from Ethan's outside counsel. Marcus had drafted it himself over 3 separate evenings, and had torn up 2 versions before arriving at the third, which was the most precise and most damaging, and therefore the only one he could file with a clear conscience. The disclosure stated in full that Marcus Hale, as principal of Hale and Associates, had a pre-existing contractual obligation to provide legal representation to Dex Calloway of Iron Compass MC, that Dex Calloway had sustained property damage attributable to Ethan James Hale, listed as an immediate family member of a client of Hale and Associates, that this created an irresolvable conflict of interest preventing Marcus from representing Ethan, and that Marcus was proactively disclosing the conflict and formally registering Dex Calloway as his client in the matter. He did not file for dispensation. He did not request an exception. He stated the facts and attached the contract and let the document say what it said. He had told Ethan to come to the office at 10 o'clock Thursday morning when he intended to show him the filing before submitting it. Ethan arrived at 9:58. He looked different than he had on Monday. The jacket was gone. He was wearing a plain gray shirt and jeans, and he had the slightly raw look of someone who had not been sleeping well and had stopped trying to conceal it. He had been meeting with his own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chow, at the Noda firm whom Marcus had looked up and found to be solid, methodical, with a good record in civil liability. And Marcus had noticed in their one brief phone interaction about procedural matters that Ethan had chosen her without asking his father's opinion. He had also, in the 11 days since the parking lot, not called Marcus once to ask for advice, information, or reassurance. This was so unusual that Marcus had initially checked his phone multiple times to see if he'd missed calls. He had not. Ethan was learning something in his lawyer's office, or his apartment, or somewhere between the two, about the difference between having a father who handled things and handling things. Marcus found this simultaneously painful and more hopeful than he'd felt in some time. He showed Ethan the filing. Ethan read it standing at the desk, both hands on the surface, bending slightly forward, reading it the way he'd been taught to read legal documents. Slowly, without skimming, attending to the precision of each sentence. When he finished, he stood up and was quiet for a moment. "This ends your ability to help me with this at all," Ethan said. "Yes, and if the bar decides to investigate the original conflict, they may decide to. I've disclosed fully. I'm not expecting preferential treatment." Marcus looked at him. "I want you to understand that this is what disclosure looks like. Not managing the exposure, not controlling the narrative, writing down what happened and submitting it." "I know what disclosure looks like, Dad. I have a law degree." "I know you do." Marcus sat down. "I'm not being patronizing. I'm telling you this because I spent 11 days trying to figure out if there was another way to do this that protected more people at once. And there wasn't. And instead of looking for a third path, I wrote this." He gestured at the document. "That's different from how I usually operate, and I want you to know I know it's different." Ethan looked at the document for another moment. Then he said, "When you file this, it becomes a matter of record. Everything in it." "Yes, including the fact that you drafted the contract clause, the one that created this whole—" "Yes, and your relationship with Dex, the history. The filing references the contract. The contract speaks for itself on the relationship." Marcus looked at him steadily. "I'm not hiding any of it, Ethan." Ethan sat down across from him. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the filing on the desk. "I read the case," he said. "The one from 10 years ago. I found the public record." He looked up. "He saved you. Not metaphorically. The case would have gone differently without his testimony." "Yes. And after that, the retainer. The clause, that was you taking care of him." "It was supposed to be." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "It was also me making sure that what he'd done for me was documented in a way that looked like a professional relationship rather than a personal debt, which was neater, more manageable." He paused. "I'm good at making things look neat." Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, "I want to be there when you tell him, when you formally register him as your client. I want to be in the room." "That wasn't part of—" "I know, I'm asking." He looked at his father directly, not from behind anything. "I filmed his bike burning. I watched it happen, and I felt good about it for 30 seconds, and then I spent 11 days figuring out why. I think I know why now, or enough of it. I want to tell him. Not to change what happens legally, just because he deserves to have me say it to his face." Marcus looked at his son for a long moment. He thought about the man he'd wanted Ethan to be, the man he'd imagined since Elena died, the version of Ethan that Marcus had been curating without entirely meaning to. The son who would walk into Hale and Associates ready to take the name and do it justice. He thought about what that curating had actually produced. And then he looked at the person sitting across from him, the one with the raw face and the plain gray shirt, who had hired his own lawyer and read the public case record, and wanted to say something to Dex Calloway's face not for legal advantage, but because it was owed. This was not the man Marcus had curated. This was someone emerging from the other side of something that hurt, and it was much better. "All right," Marcus said. "You can be there." He filed the disclosure at 10:31. He called Dex at 10:45 and said, "I've filed. I want to come out to the shop and walk you through it. I'm bringing Ethan." A pause. "Okay," Dex said. "He asked to be there. He wants to say something to you." Another pause. "All right." They drove separately, Marcus's instruction, because he wanted Ethan to have the choice to leave if the meeting went somewhere difficult, and because arriving in the same car still felt too much like one person managing another. Marcus arrived first and found Dex at the workbench, where he always seemed to be when Marcus arrived, which was either coincidence or Dex's way of saying that his world proceeded on its own terms, regardless of who came through the bay door. He was working on something different now, a fuel tank with a substantial dent in the lower curve, the kind of patient extraction work that takes hours and requires a great deal of stillness. He set it aside when Marcus came in. Marcus placed a copy of the filed disclosure on the workbench. Dex read it standing, same as Ethan had, and with the same slow, careful attention. He turned the last page, saw Marcus's signature and the bar filing number, and set it down. "You went first," Dex said. "I went first. Before anyone filed a complaint." "Yes." Dex was quiet for a moment. He looked at the copy of the disclosure on the workbench, and then at Marcus. "Why first? You could have waited to see if I'd file."
Maybe I wouldn't have.
"I know, but it's the right procedure, and—" Marcus stopped. He looked at the bay door at the strip of afternoon light on the concrete floor. "You told the truth in that courtroom because it was what was owed, not because it benefited you. I've been living on the benefit of that for 10 years. He looked at Dex. "This is me trying to act accordingly." Dex looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, with the particular weight of a person who has been waiting for something and has just received it, and is not going to make a larger production of it than it requires. Ethan's car pulled into the lot outside. They both heard it, the slightly uneven idle of the Audi that Marcus had been meaning to mention to him for months. Ethan came through the bay door and stopped and looked at Dex, and there was a moment in which none of the three of them moved. Ethan said, "Can I talk?" Dex crossed his arms, not defensively, just settling in. "Go ahead." "I've been trying to figure out what to say since last Monday. I've written it out a few times because that's—" He paused. "That's how I was taught to approach things I'm afraid of. Write it out, find the argument, practice it. I'm not going to do that." He looked at Dex without looking away. "I burned your bike because I was drunk and angry, and I wanted to do something that couldn't be taken back. I wanted to feel like I had power over something. That's the honest answer. Not that I didn't know what I was doing. I knew enough. Not that I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't think about who it would hurt, which is a different thing, and not better." The bay was very quiet. The apprentice was not there today. The shop felt larger for it. "The part I keep coming back to," Ethan said, "is that I filmed it. I stood there and I filmed it, and for a little while I felt good. And I've been sitting with that for 11 days. And what I've figured out is that feeling was about my father, not about you at all. You were just the thing that was in front of me." He stopped. He looked at the workbench where the fuel tank sat with its dent half extracted. "That doesn't make it better. I know that. I'm not saying it to make it better. I'm saying it because you asked that first day you asked if I'd understand what I actually did, and I'm trying to answer that question honestly." Dex looked at him for a long time. His expression didn't shift towards softness exactly. Dex Calloway's face was not built for sudden softness, but something in it acknowledged that it was hearing something true. "Your father told you about the restoration," he said. "Yes." "The work that can't be replaced." "Yes." Dex uncrossed his arms. He picked up the fuel tank from the workbench and turned it in his hands, examining the dent, and then set it back down. "My brother taught me," he said. "Restoration work. He was better at it than I am, more patient. He could work on the same panel for 6 hours without getting frustrated. I've never had that kind of patience." He paused. "He passed away 7 years ago. The bike was the last project we planned out together. I've been building it toward what he would have wanted it to be." He looked at Ethan. "That's what was in it." The words landed in the bay and stayed there. Ethan's jaw tightened and then released. He didn't look away. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were very plain, not dressed up in qualifying language or legal, careful phrasing. "I'm sorry for what I burned, and for why I burned it, and for the fact that I filmed it. I'm sorry." Dex looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, "I heard you." He did not say, "I forgive you." He did not say, "It's okay." He said, "I heard you," and it was precisely and exactly what the moment required. Not a word more or less. And Ethan seemed to understand this, because he didn't push for anything further. Marcus stood at the edge of the bay and watched his son receive an honest response to an honest admission, without trying to negotiate it into something more comfortable. And he recognized this as a form of maturity he had not, if he was being truthful with himself, done very much to develop. Ethan had found it somewhere, despite Marcus, or perhaps in the last 11 days because of what Marcus had finally stopped doing. "The filing means I'm your lawyer," Marcus said to Dex, because the practical reality needed stating. "Formally, as of this morning, Patricia Chow's office has been notified. We'll be on opposing sides of any proceedings." "I know. I'm going to represent you well." Dex looked at him. Something in his face shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, but its structural antecedent. "I know that too," he said. Ethan stood near the bay door and looked out at the parking lot at his car, with its slightly uneven idle at the afternoon light on Beatty's Ford Road, where the traffic was moving in the particular unhurried way of a side street in a city that was always partly in a hurry and partly not. He was not running a play. He was not drafting an argument. He was standing in a motorcycle shop in Charlotte, North Carolina, with nothing in front of him that had been managed or arranged. And Marcus watched him stand there and thought, "This is what I should have been giving him. Not the cleared path. This." But the filing was done, and the copies were on the workbench, and Ethan's outside counsel had been notified, and the moment of choosing was past. What came next was proceedings civil liability, the terms of whatever Patricia Chow and Marcus between them could negotiate, whatever the state bar decided to do with the disclosure. The legal machinery was in motion, and would move the way legal machinery moves, with its own pace and its own logic. There was also the question, unresolved and sitting in the room like a guest no one had formally invited, of the members of Iron Compass MC who had not yet received the satisfaction they'd been looking for. Rafe had held them through 11 days. Marcus was not certain how much longer that would hold. He looked at Dex, and Dex looked at him, and the look contained a shared awareness of this, because they were both men who understood that formal proceedings moved at one speed, and human anger moved at another, and the gap between those speeds was where the dangerous things happened. "Rafe knows the timeline," Marcus asked. "Rafe knows everything I know," Dex said. He picked up the fuel tank again and positioned it in the vise on the workbench, making a small adjustment. "You should know 2 of the members have been talking to a personal injury attorney independently, not through the club, independently." "I know. Their attorney contacted Patricia Chow's office." Marcus paused. "It's their right." "I know it's their right. I'm telling you the temperature." He turned a screw on the vise once, very precisely. "You've got maybe a week before the temperature becomes something else." Ethan turned from the bay door. He had been listening. "What does something else mean?" Dex looked at him directly. "It means some of them don't trust this process. They've been in situations before where the process favored the guy with the better lawyer, and they lost, and they remember that." "My dad is their lawyer," Ethan said. "Yes, that's helping, but they don't know you yet. They know what you did." He paused. "The formal process handles the money and the record. It doesn't handle what they need to look at." He looked at Ethan for a moment. "That's a separate conversation, and I can't have it for you." Ethan was quiet. He looked at the bay, at the workbench, at the fuel tank in the vise. "Would it help if I came here?" he said. Not as a gesture. I mean, actually came. Did something useful." Dex looked at him for a long moment. "I can work," Ethan said. "I know how to work. He stopped. He looked at the tank again. "I've never actually done it for anything that mattered." Marcus stood very still. Dex picked up a dolly from the workbench, a small, flat-headed hammer-like tool used for the interior side of a metal panel, and turned it in his hands and looked at the dent in the tank, and then at Ethan. "You'd be here for me to look at," he said, "and for Rafe's guys to look at, while the legal thing moves. You understand that?" "Yes. It won't substitute for the legal process." "I know. But it won't hurt it either." He set the dolly down on the bench. "Think about it. Don't answer right now." He turned back to the tank. Marcus looked at his son one more time and saw someone standing in a bay in Charlotte with nothing arranged in front of him, figuring out what to do next on his own. He turned and walked back to the Mercedes, and he sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, and out of the bay window he could see Dex working and Ethan still standing near the door, watching, and neither of them was talking. But they were occupying the same space without hostility. It was not resolution. It was not forgiveness. It was two people in a room together being honest about where they were, and Marcus, who had spent 40 years arranging rooms so that people were exactly where he needed them to be, recognized this as something that no arrangement could produce. He started the car. He drove toward the office, and as he drove, he thought about the week ahead. The state bar reviewing the disclosure, Patricia Chow preparing her case, Rafe Ortega holding a temperature he'd said would not hold much longer. The legal process was clean. The human reality around it was not clean, and Marcus knew from 4 decades of practice that it was always the human reality around the process that determined whether the process actually delivered anything worth delivering. He thought about what Dex had said. They need to look at him. He thought about Ethan standing near the bay door, watching a man work on something with patient hands and saying, "I've never actually done it for anything that mattered." He thought making the turn onto I-277 North, with the city opening out around him, that this was the truest thing his son had said in a very long time, and that it had been said in a motorcycle shop on Beatty's Ford Road. Not to Marcus, not to any audience, but to a man who needed to hear it, and could recognize when it was real. The disclosure was filed. Ethan had his own lawyer. The case would proceed. And somewhere in the proceeding, in the gap between the legal timeline and the human one, something was going to have to be built by people who were not good at building things yet. Marcus included, perhaps especially Marcus. He made another turn and merged onto the highway and let the city fall behind him. And in the quiet of the car, he allowed himself to feel, without managing it, the full weight of what the last 11 days had cost, and what they had, against considerable odds, also returned. What a man owes. The hearing that would determine civil liability in the matter of Calloway versus Hale was scheduled for Thursday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the fire. In the weeks between the filing and the hearing, Charlotte went through that brief season it sometimes managed in early fall, 2 weeks of actual cool air before the heat came back for a final argument, and Beatty's Ford Road in that light was a different place than it had been in the summer. The trees along the median going yellow at the tips, and the morning air carrying enough edge to make the first hour in the shop genuinely pleasant. Ethan had been coming to Calloway Custom Cycles 3 times a week since the Thursday in the bay. Not every day Dex had been specific about that, in the same way he was specific about everything 3 days afternoons, starting with cleaning tasks and parts inventory, and working toward actual hands-on work when and if the skill was there. Ethan showed up the first Tuesday not knowing where to stand, and spent 2 hours reorganizing the parts bins in the back room according to a system Dex explained once and did not explain again. He showed up Thursday and helped a customer process a service order. He showed up the following Tuesday, and Dex handed him a wire brush and pointed at a frame section that needed prep work and said, "Not fast, right." He was not fast. He was not yet particularly right, but he came back. The members of Iron Compass MC who had wanted something more than the formal process were not all of them converted by this. 2 of them, a man named Curtis Braid and a second-generation member called Wick, made it known through Rafe that the shop appearances were optics, that a rich kid doing chores to offset a criminal act was not the same as accountability, and that until the hearing produced a number that actually hurt, they weren't going to call it finished. Marcus heard this through Rafe, and Rafe heard it from Dex, and the chain of information was itself a kind of structure, everyone knowing where they stood in relation to everyone else, which was the minimum architecture of something not exploding. The Tuesday before the hearing, Curtis Braid and Wick showed up at Ethan's apartment. Ethan had not been told they were coming. He knew they existed. Dex had named them once without editorializing, and he knew they were unhappy. He opened his apartment door at 7 in the evening to find two men in iron compass jackets standing in the hallway, and his first reflex was to look past them for someone else, and there was no one else, and the reflex landed on him for what it was. "Come in," he said. Curtis Braid was in his 50s, built like a man who had done physical work his entire life, and carried it differently now. Not the lean toughness of youth, but the denser, settled weight of someone whose body had absorbed decades of real use. He did not come in immediately. He stood in the doorway and looked at the apartment, not aggressively, but with the particular attention of a man reading a space for what it said about the person who lived there. The apartment was expensive in the way of a good address and good furniture that was also notably empty of personal artifacts. No photos on the walls, no accumulated mess, no evidence of habits or preferences. A good address lived in at arm's length. "You can come in," Ethan said again. Curtis came in. Wick stayed near the door. They were not, Ethan noted, here to hurt him. They were carrying themselves with deliberate restraint, the constraint of men who had decided before arriving to stay on one side of a line, but who needed him to understand that the line was there. "You've been coming to the shop," Curtis said. It was not a question. 3 days a week. "Dex tell you why that matters to us?" "He said you needed to look at me." Ethan sat down on the couch, which put him lower than both of them, and he did not do it to be strategic. He did it because his legs felt unsteady, and sitting down was the honest response. "I understand that." Curtis looked at him. "You understand it?" He repeated the way people repeat things when they're testing whether a phrase means anything behind it. "I understand that the formal process doesn't give you what you need," Ethan said. "The civil suit is about the bike and the money and the record. It doesn't address the fact that I stood in that parking lot and felt good about what I was doing." He looked at Curtis. "Dex has seen me 3 times a week for 4 weeks. I'm not going to tell you what to think about that, but I'm going to keep showing up." "That's easy to say." "Yes, it is." He did not add anything to soften it. Curtis looked at him for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way a jaw works when something is being processed that the person doesn't want to give easy expression to. "You know what Dex's brother was to this club," he said. Ethan shook his head. "Marco Calloway rode with us for 11 years. He was the guy who—" Curtis stopped. He looked at the empty wall above the couch and then back at Ethan. "When your bike breaks down on the side of 85 at 2 in the morning, you call your people. Marco was who everybody called. He'd come out in the rain and the cold, didn't matter. He fixed the problem, and he didn't say a word about it afterward. That's the kind of person he was." He paused. The Road King was Dex's way of finishing what he and Marco planned together. You didn't just burn a bike. You burned what was left of that. The apartment was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. The strip of light under the door held still. Ethan said, "I know that now." "That's the problem," Curtis said, and his voice for the first time had heat in it. Not explosive heat, but the sustained, low heat of old fuel burning. "You know it now. You didn't know it then. You didn't ask, didn't think, didn't look. You saw something that belonged to someone, and you decided your feelings about your daddy were more important than whatever that thing was." He leaned forward slightly. "You had been in that parking lot for what, 40 minutes? You didn't know one thing about whose bike that was, and you didn't care because knowing wasn't required, because you've never had to know." Ethan sat with this. He sat with it, without defending against it. And Curtis watched him do it, and something in Curtis's posture not softening exactly, but the slight release of a man who has been preparing to deliver something and has now delivered it and is waiting to see what it does, shifted. "You're right," Ethan said. "All of that is right." Wick from the door said, "You ever work with your hands before the shop?" "Not really. My dad—" He stopped. He started again. "I was kept away from things that might go wrong. And now your hands are going wrong at the shop," Wick said, not unkindly. "But you're coming back." "Yes." Wick looked at Curtis. Some exchange passed between them, the economy of communication between men who have known each other a long time, where a look does work that sentences would make clumsy. Curtis straightened up. He looked at Ethan one final time and said, "The hearing's Thursday. Whatever that produces, produces. After that, we'll see." He paused. "Dex makes up his own mind. I'm not speaking for him. But I want you to understand what you actually did from people who actually knew Marco." He moved toward the door. "Now you do." He left. Wick followed without speaking. The door closed. Ethan sat on the couch in his apartment and looked at the empty wall above where Curtis had been standing, and he let himself fully feel for the first time, without trying to organize it into something manageable, the dimensions of what a single, drunk, self-pitying decision had reached. Not just the bike, the brother, the years of work, the men in that parking lot, the man in his living room just now carrying something heavy and specific that Ethan had put into motion without knowing the name of it. He sat there for a long time. He did not call his father. He did not call Corey. He sat in his apartment with the weight of it, and this was, he thought, probably what people meant when they talked about accountability. Not the legal process, not the money, but the sitting in your own apartment after two men you wronged have come and gone, and not looking away from what they left behind. He called Patricia Chow in the morning and told her he wanted to make a statement at the hearing. A personal statement, not legal testimony. She said she'd look into the format. He said he understood if it wasn't possible procedurally, but that he wanted it on record that he'd tried. The hearing was held in a civil courtroom on East Trade Street, and it was smaller than Ethan had expected. Smaller physically, with the stripped-down efficiency of a proceeding that was not a trial, where the dramatic architecture of full courtrooms was replaced by a conference table, at the front a dais for the arbitrating judge, and rows of standard chairs. Marcus and Dex sat on one side of the center aisle. Patricia Chow and Ethan sat on the other. Rafe was in the gallery with two club members Ethan recognized and two he didn't. The proceedings started cleanly. Patricia Chow laid out Ethan's position, acknowledgement of liability, willingness to pay replacement cost, plus documented damages. The argument that emotional distress damages, as claimed, should be limited to a specific, quantifiable range. Marcus, representing Dex, laid out the countervailing position with the same precision he always brought, and Ethan watched his father argue against him in a formal setting for the first time, and it was a strange and clarifying thing to see Marcus using his full professional skill not on his behalf. The thing that nearly derailed it was Section 4C of the retainer contract. Patricia Chow argued it in the room, on her feet, with a controlled confidence that Ethan recognized as the sign of someone who had found something and prepared it carefully. Your Honor, the basis for Mr. Hale's representation of Mr. Calloway rests entirely on a contractual clause whose application to this matter is at minimum contestable. The plaintiff argues that Ethan Hale falls within the definition of immediate family member of a client. However, the engagement record shows a single week of administrative work, with no active client files, no billable hours, and no signed representation agreement between Ethan Hale and Hale & Associates. Under a strict reading, the engagement record shows a W-2 with the firm's EIN, Marcus said from across the table. A W-2 for 1 week of clerical? A W-2 is an employment record counselor. Under the language of Section 4C, employment with the firm qualifies as client family member status. He looked at the arbitrating judge, a woman in her early 60s named Judge Helen Park, who was watching both attorneys with the alert stillness of someone listening to a good argument with genuine interest. The clause was written broadly by design. I wrote it. I can speak to intent. Your testimony about intent doesn't override the plain language. The plain language supports my reading. With respect, Mr. Hale, it's a contested reading, and we would ask that the matter of the contractual basis for your representation be referred to the Bar Ethics Panel before this proceeding continues. Judge Park looked at the papers in front of her. That's a significant procedural request, Ms. Chow. What's the basis for urgency? If Mr. Hale's representation lacks valid contractual foundation, the entire agreement he filed with the bar, the conflict, disclosure, the formal registration, needs review. We're not challenging his good faith. We're challenging the mechanism. Patricia was steady on her feet, not aggressive, just precise. A week of clerical work was enough to constitute immediate family member of a client under this clause. If that's the standard, we need the ethics panel to confirm it, because the implications for the firm's other clients would be... I'll address this, Marcus said. He stood up and looked at Judge Park, and then, for a moment, at Dex. Your Honor, I'm going to ask to make a statement that goes beyond the strict legal argument. It's relevant to why this proceeding matters to me beyond the professional. Judge Park nodded. Marcus turned, and he was not looking at the judge now. He was looking at Dex and at Rafe in the gallery, and at the two members Ethan didn't know, and at Ethan. He was looking at all of them at once, which was something Ethan had not seen his father do. Marcus's professional mode was always precisely targeted, the right argument to the right person in the right sequence. This was different. The clause is mine, Marcus said. I wrote it. Ms. Chow is correct that the language is broad, and I wrote it to be broad because I had specific reasons. 10 years ago, Dex Calloway did something that was not easy at personal cost, because he believed the truth mattered more than the convenient outcome. I built a protection into our agreement because I believed the men in that club deserved the same protection they'd given me, the knowledge that someone in the legal system would stand with them without qualification when they needed it. He paused. The room was very still. My son burned Dex's bike. The clause I wrote means I represent Dex. Ms. Chow is arguing that the clause's application is contestable, and she may be right on the technical interpretation. But the question of whether the clause applies is secondary to the question of whether it should apply. And I am telling this room on the record that it should. Not because of the technical definition of client-family member, because Ethan Hale, my son, did damage to a man I owe, and the protection I promised is being tested by the exact circumstances I designed it for, and I am not going to use the ambiguity in my own language as an exit. Judge Park looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Hale, she said, that's an unusual statement for counsel to make on the record. Yes, Your Honor, it's an unusual situation. He sat down. The ethics referral motion did not carry. Judge Park ruled that on the existing documentation, the W-2, the public engagement record, the proactive bar disclosure, the clause's application was defensible, and that the substance of the proceeding would continue. Patricia Chow accepted the ruling without visible emotion, which was professionalism, and made a note, which was precision. The settlement number, when it arrived 2 hours later, via Judge Park's recommendation, was $41,000 replacement value, plus documented emotional damages, plus a court-documented acknowledgement of liability, signed by Ethan personally, not by Marcus, not by the firm, not by an insurance company. Ethan's name on the acknowledgement in the public record. Patricia Chow had told him before the hearing that this would be the outcome if the proceeding went the normal route, and that he should be prepared for it. He had said he was prepared. Now it was a real document, and he was looking at his name on it, and he was prepared. It felt different than prepared, but in a way he thought was probably right. He looked across the aisle at his father. Marcus was putting papers into his briefcase. His movements were the same as always, precise, efficient. But there was something in his posture that Ethan couldn't quite name, something that had been there since the personal statement and had not left. A lightness, maybe was not quite the word, more like a reduction, the weight of something removed. He caught Ethan looking and did not smile, but he held the look for a moment. In the gallery, Rafe stood up first. He said something to the man next to him and then walked to the edge of the center aisle. He looked at Dex, who was talking to Marcus in the low, quick way of two people wrapping up business. And then he looked at Ethan. "He's coming to Sully's Friday night," Rafe said. "Dex, club gets together the first Friday of the month." He paused. "You don't have to come, but you could." Ethan looked at him. Is that an invitation?" "It's an information statement," Rafe said. "What you do with it is your own business." He walked out of the courtroom. The two members followed. The room was mostly empty now the gallery cleared, Judge Park gone through the side door, just Marcus and Dex finishing their conversation, and Patricia Chow gathering her materials. Ethan sat in the chair a moment longer. He thought about Friday night, and about the parking lot, and about Curtis Braid's face in his living room, and about Marco Calloway, who fixed bikes by the side of the highway in the rain and didn't say anything about it afterward. He thought about the Road King with 3 coats of finish and lettering by a man in Asheville who was gone now. He thought about what it meant to build something that took years and required other people and survived in their absence. He stood up. Friday night, Sully's Bar on Reedsville Road. The floodlight above the back door had been replaced. New bulb, steady, light, no flicker. And the parking lot was full in a way that made the space look completely different from how it had looked 6 weeks ago. 12 bikes, a few trucks, the sound of something that was not quite music and not quite conversation coming through the back door and becoming both when you were close enough. Ethan arrived at 8:15. He parked the Audi at the far edge of the gravel lot, the same spot as before, and sat in it for a moment. He got out. He walked to the back door. He opened it and went in. The inside of Sully's was a bar that had been a bar for a long time, with all that entailed worn wood, old neon, the layered smell of beer, and decades of cigarette smoke embedded in the ceiling tiles, even though no one had smoked in there since 2010. There was a pool table occupied. There was a jukebox operating. There were approximately 25 people, most of them in Iron Compass jackets, and the ambient sounds dropped by about 30% when Ethan came through the door. Rafe was at the bar. He saw Ethan come in, looked at him for a moment, and nodded once. He did not move toward him or away from him. He turned back to his drink. Dex was at a table in the back with Curtis and Wick and 2 others. He saw Ethan come in. He picked up his beer and took a drink and set it down and looked at the table and then back toward the door and said something to Curtis that Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan stood near the door and did not perform composure. His hands were at his sides. He was wearing the plain gray shirt again, the same one as the meeting in the bay, because it was the only thing he owned that felt like it was dressed at the right level for this specific room, not trying to be anything except present. After a moment, Dex pushed his chair back and stood up and walked across the bar. He stopped in front of Ethan. "You came," he said. "Rafe told me first Friday of the month. He tells that to people he's decided something about." Dex looked at him with the same steady directness he'd always had. The look of a man who took measurements and kept them. "You've been at the shop 4 weeks. Yes. You wire brushed that whole frame section wrong the second week. Too much pressure on the curved sections. I know, you showed me. You did it right the week after." "Yes." Dex was quiet for a moment. Around them, the bar had returned to its general volume. The conversation, the jukebox, the crack of the pool table, but there was a quality to the space nearest them that was slightly more aware of itself than the rest of the room. "The hearing went the way it went," Dex said. "The number is what it is. The record is what it is." "Yes, what your father said in the room." He paused. "I didn't ask him to say that." "I know you didn't. He did it because—" Dex stopped. He seemed to be deciding how much language the moment required. "I've known your father for 10 years. He's the best I've seen at finding the way that costs him the least. Thursday was the first time I've seen him find the way that cost him the most instead." He looked at Ethan. That came from somewhere. Ethan thought about the list Marcus had started writing. Things I shielded Ethan from, and the reasons and what it cost, the legal pad he'd seen on his father's desk during a visit to the office that week, covered in his father's precise longhand. He hadn't read it. He hadn't asked about it. But he'd seen it, and he knew his father, and he knew that the list was real. "He's working on something," Ethan said. I don't know what it looks like from the outside yet." "I'll tell you what it looks like," Dex said. "It looks like a man who found out he'd been wrong about something important for a long time and decided not to be wrong about it anymore." He paused. "That's a harder thing than most people manage." The jukebox changed to something slower. At the pool table, someone made a shot, and there was a brief sound of reaction. The bar moved around them in its ordinary Friday night way. "I want to keep coming to the shop," Ethan said, "after the case is closed. Not because of the case." Dex looked at him. "I want to learn how to do the work," Ethan said. "Not all of it. I'm not saying I want to be a mechanic. I'm saying I want to know how to build something with my hands that doesn't fall apart when I'm not watching it." He paused. "I think I need to know how to do that." Dex was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his beer from the nearest table he'd carried it across without seeming to, and took a drink and set it down again. "You know how to use a wrench," he said. It was almost exactly what Ethan had imagined him saying. Had imagined some version of this since the day in the bay when he'd first asked to stay, some version of a door opening or not opening, some version of an answer that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't indifference, but was something in between that had its own specific weight. He had not expected the joke, or the thing that was almost a joke, the dry recurrence of the question that meant, yes, from this point under certain conditions, in a particular kind of way that we're going to define by showing up, and not by talking about it. "I'm learning," Ethan said. Dex looked at him for a moment longer, and then said, "Curtis makes good chili. He brings it the first Friday. If you're going to be here, you might as well eat something." He walked back toward his table. He did not look back to see if Ethan followed. Ethan stood near the door of Sully's bar for a moment, and the light was steady in the parking lot now, and the sound of the bar was all around him, and he walked across the room toward the table in the back, where Curtis Braid was ladling chili from a pot that had appeared from somewhere, because of course it had, because these were people who knew where the chili was, and who brought it, and how it was done. And Ethan did not know any of that yet, but he was here, and he was not behind his father, and the door was open. The following Monday, Marcus Hale sat in his corner office on the 14th floor of Hale and Associates and drafted a letter to the 4 senior partners of the firm. The letter was not long. It stated that effective the first of the year, the firm would be formalizing its pro bono commitment to underserved clients in civil matters, specifically clients who had previously been underserved in proceedings due to lack of adequate representation. The program would be administered by a committee including, if he accepted the appointment, a community liaison to be named by Iron Compass MC. The letter noted that this arrangement had roots in an existing relationship of 10 years standing, and that the firm was overdue in making it structural. He signed the letter and put it in the outbox, and looked at Charlotte through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and thought about what else was overdue. There was a considerable list. He had the legal pad, and it was not finished. He thought he would be working on it for a long time. His phone rang. It was Ethan. "Hey," Ethan said. "Hey," Marcus said. A pause that was different from the pauses they usually had, not full of things not being said, just a moment of quiet between two people who had been through something and were finding the frequency. "I'm going back to Calloway's Thursday," Ethan said. "I want to finish the prep work on the frame section before they start the new coat." "All right. And I've been looking at the bar exam schedule." Marcus was quiet. "February sitting," Ethan said. "I think I want to take it. Not for the firm, just..." He paused. "Just because I want to know if I can do it when it's mine." Marcus looked at the letter in the outbox. He looked at the city. He thought about all the things he'd always said after "I want to" when Ethan said something like this. The assessments, the timelines, the careful management of expectations. He thought about what it would mean to say none of them. "Okay," he said. "That's it. That's it." Another pause. "I'll call you when I know the registration deadline," Ethan said. "All right, Dad." A beat. "Thursday after Calloway's, do you want to get dinner?" Marcus looked at the window and the light on the glass and the city moving below in its ordinary Monday way. He thought about what it would mean to have dinner with his son, not as a managed check-in or a strategic conversation, but as two people who had come through something and were on the other side of it, and were figuring out what that looked like. "Yes," Marcus said. "I want to get dinner." "Okay," Ethan said. "I'll call you Thursday." He hung up. Marcus set the phone down and sat in his office with the morning light coming through the windows and the letter in the outbox and the legal pad on the corner of his desk, and he sat there for a moment, just sat, which was not something he did often, and let the quiet of it be what it was. He had represented people his entire adult life. He had argued their cases, drafted their documents, managed their exposure, found the exit routes when they needed them. He had been, by all the metrics available, very good at it. He had also, in the name of love and in the absence of his wife, managed his son's exposure so thoroughly that Ethan had reached 24 without the internal architecture to face anything real. He was going to be different about this now. He did not have a precise plan for how, which was itself something new. Marcus Hale with a legal pad and a growing list, instead of a finished argument. He thought this was probably what it was supposed to feel like. He thought Elena would have told him so 16 years ago if he had thought to ask. He picked up the legal pad. He uncapped the pen. He added one line to the list at the bottom in the space where he'd been leaving room without quite knowing why. The line said, "What love actually looks like. Work on this." He put the cap back on the pen. He pulled the next file from the stack on his desk. He began to read.